First mentioning in the Bible is in Acts chapter 7 in verse 58, of course, at the stoning of Stephen. And Paul, of course, was that, at that time, the infamous persecutor, became the famous preacher. So let us just jump in here and walk through. Go ahead and go to the first slide or the next slide on the list. Actually, two of them. Go 2 slides. And we'll talk about the fact that he was born around 5 A.D. And he's from the tribe of Benjamin, named Saul. Guess that he probably was named after King Saul, the famous Benjaminite. He was a Roman citizen. I am learning more and more studying the life of Paul, how much of a privilege that was. And so that was indeed a great privilege. We think about having our citizenship here in the United States, which is a privilege, but comparably, the Roman citizenship was not handed out nearly as often as U.S. citizenships are. And there was a lot of benefits of being a Roman citizen. Came from a well-respected family from Tarsus in the region of Cilicia. And you see the little map that I have there that shows you about where Tarsus is in compared to Jerusalem. It is quite a long ways from Jerusalem. So go ahead and go to the next slide. Student of Gamaliel. Student of Gamaliel. Now that was also something that he wore as somewhat of a badge of honor. He was someone that had been in the great school of Gamaliel. Now he was a member of the strictest Jewish sect called the Pharisees. Now we always think of the Pharisees as the bad guys, but the Pharisees in the Jewish culture were a well-respected people. Let's look at the Bible in Acts chapter 7 and verse 58, and we will see the first mentioning of the Apostle Paul. So verse 58 of Acts chapter 7 says, they cast him, that it would be Stephen, they cast him out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. A young man named Saul. The next chapter says, and Saul was consenting to, that is, Stephen's death. And at that time a great persecution arose against the church, which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the region of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. It goes on to say in verse 3, and as for Saul, he made havoc of the church. Now that word havoc is descriptive of an army going through a city and decimating it, destroying it. He made havoc of the city, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. Therefore, those who were scattered went everywhere, preaching the word. Even in Paul's persecution, he spread the gospel. Isn't that something to think about? So, we have the first mention of Stephen. Let's go to the next slide here. It talks about Tarsus. Let's talk about Tarsus just for a little bit. I know this is things that we've looked at before. But Tarsus was an important city. It was actually second, go ahead and go to the next slide, second only to Athens. And in the realm of education and philosophy. A great commercial city on the major trade route, east-west Roman road. And go ahead and go to the next slide. Let's look at a picture as I continue to describe. So you'll see there is Tarsus on the Cydnus River. It was a great commercial city because it was on an east-west travel route, Roman road, but it was also on the, what I call the ship routes, along that Palestinian coast and then even into the Asian coast. And it happened to be in that Cydnus River. They had a great port there where ships would come up the coast of Palestine to meet ships that were coming along the they would trade, they would unload some ships and load other ships, and it was trading back and forth, and that was a great place that happened. Tarsus was also a very large city when it came to population. It was a very large city. I think I told you this last time, but to repeat myself, I'm getting old. You see that very wide street. And I was told when I was in Greece that the wider the streets, the more populated the city. Well, that makes only sense. And so the city of Tarsus, the ancient city of Tarsus, had very wide streets, which indicates it was a very large city. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Now, Paul was a very strict Jew living in a Roman world. We know that he was a tent maker. A tent maker. Now, that can mean everything from, yes, making the material which they would then make tents out of, but it could also have been material that could have been used for rugs. It could have been material used for bedding. It could have been a lot of different tapestries that were woven and made. And it was as he said, he lived in no mean city. He was also involved in no mean trade as well. This was a very important trade. Everything from the very industrial, as in making good material that would repel the rain, but also that there was an artistry to that as well. And we think of those Persian rugs and all of those kinds of things. Well, this is the same kind of work that the Apostle Paul was in. So Paul also had to learn as a very young man, had to learn both to be a Jew, but to live in a Roman world. I think I said last time, anybody can point back to things in their past, how God has prepared you for what you're doing right now. And I can name countless things that God has done for me through the years. Living on a farm, I know all of the farming metaphors in Scripture. Being raised by a bricklayer, I know all the architectural and building metaphors in Scripture, and there are many. So God knew what he was doing in bringing me through all of this. Well, I have a verse of Scripture here from Philippians chapter 3 and verse 5. From the New Living Translation, the reason I have it is because I like this one phrase. A real Hebrew, if there ever was one. That's probably quite a loose translation, but this is what Paul said. He said, if there ever was a Hebrew, I was one. I was a Hebrew of the Hebrews. I was circumcised when I was 8 days old, a pure-blooded citizen of Israel, member of the tribe of Benjamin, a real Hebrew if there ever was one. I was a member of the Pharisees who demanded the strictest obedience to the Jewish law. A Pharisee, we'll talk just a little bit about them. Go ahead and go to the next slide. You see that picture there? I'm not saying that that's what they looked like back in the Bible days. I believe this picture was taken actually back in the 1800s. But a picture of some Jewish men there. Paul would not have looked much like us at all. He would have looked quite different. Go ahead and go to the next slide. The Pharisees, a highly respected group of people, they were known for their knowledge of Scripture. Many of them were scribes, lawyers. The Sadducees, on the other hand, were much more the political leaders. They were often the priests, the high priests. They were the Sadducees. The Pharisees was the conservative group. Now, it was the Pharisees that, go ahead and go to the next slide, that led the charge to kill Jesus. They were the ones that led the charge to kill Jesus. Go and read Matthew chapter 23. And hear Jesus say, woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. Many things the Lord criticized the Pharisees for their pretense of making long prayers, for their devouring widows' houses, for their making sure that they would strain at a gnat but swallow a camel. And so all of these things were spoken of the Pharisees. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Paul says in Acts chapter 26, verses 4 and 5. My manner of life from my youth, which was spent from the beginning among my own nation at Jerusalem. So Paul was from Tarsus, but tells us that he grew up as a youth in Jerusalem. Now he could have done two things. One, he could have been born in Tarsus. Well, he was. He was born in Tarsus, and his family moved to Jerusalem later. That's one idea. The other is he was born in Tarsus, and his family, in his young age, sent him to Jerusalem to be a part of the school of Gamaliel. If that were the case, then this indicates that Paul was indeed a gifted young man. Now we think of, when my daughters were growing up, it was kind of a foregone conclusion that when they got to their senior year of high school, they needed to choose a college to go to. One has finished, the other is on her way. And that's just kind of a foregone conclusion that we send our children to college. Not so in Paul's day. To be able to actually relocate, obviously Paul had shown great potential in his young age to be trained in Judaism. He did have family. Go ahead and go to the next slide. He did have family in Jerusalem, because we find out that later on, when there was a plot to kill Paul in Jerusalem, that his sister's son found out about that, told the authorities, actually told Paul first, then told the authorities, and so Paul had a nephew that lived in Jerusalem. Paul also says in Acts 22 and verse 3, I am indeed a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law. And I want you to hear this word, and was zealous. Now I want you to hear that word, zealous toward God as you all are today. Let's look a little bit at his education. Next slide. Gamaliel. What do we know about the teacher Gamaliel? Well, let's turn to Acts chapter 5 and find the one moment where Gamaliel speaks. Think of it as what Bible information that we have that might give us a chance to look into the classroom where the Apostle Paul had attended. So verse 33. So this is there was a plot to, read verse 33. When they had heard this, they were furious and plotted to kill Peter and the other apostles. So the Sanhedrin, the council here, had decided, let's kill these troublemaking Christians, just as they had killed the Lord. Then one in the council stood up, a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, held in respect by all the people, and commanded them to put the apostles outside for a little while. In other words, let's remove these apostles and let's have a conversation. He said to them, men of Israel, take heed to yourselves what you intend to do regarding these men. For some time ago, Theodotus rose up, claiming to be somebody,
A number of men, about 400, joined him. He was slain, and all who obeyed him were scattered, and it came to nothing. After this man, Judas of Galilee, rose up in the days of the census and drew away many people after him, and he was also perished. And all who obeyed him were dispersed. And now I say to you, keep away from these men. Let them alone. For if this plan or this work is of men, it will come to nothing. But if it is of God, you cannot overthrow it, lest you even be found to fight against God. And he held such a sway in the council, it says, and they agreed with him. And when they had called for the apostles and had beaten them, they commanded them that they should not speak in the name of Jesus and let them go. Gamaliel followed in the teachings of a famous Jewish teacher of days gone by, Hillel. And it was a sort of live or let live philosophy. In other words, don't get too involved in politics. And honestly, that was kind of the Pharisaical way as well. They believed in keeping a strict Jewish community separate from the Gentiles, and we will live our lives according to the law. Don't worry so much about Greek and Roman politics. Don't get involved in that kind of stuff. We see that Gamaliel was totally against using violence to get their way. He was more of a live peacefully in the Roman city. And as Jeremiah instructed, to pray for the city. Go ahead and go to the next slide. But this was not Paul at all. He may have sat in the class of Gamaliel, but Paul was a Shammai. A Shammai was the school that believed in the aggressive approach of seeing that Israel would return to the days of King David. Any means necessary. And the key term, and that's why I asked you to listen, is the word zeal. Zeal became sort of a rallying cry for the Shemites and their desire to see Israel return to its day. From 30 to 35 AD, Paul was the most zealous and violent persecutor of Christians. Look at Philippians chapter 3 and verse 6. And I want you to notice how many times Paul uses the word zeal. Concerning zeal, persecuting the church. Next slide, Galatians 1, 13 and 14. You've heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I was advanced in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries in my own nation, being more exceedingly zealous for the traditions of my fathers. Acts 22, let's see, am I on the right slide here? Acts 22 and verses 3 and 4. I am indeed a Jew, born of Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in the city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law, and was zealous toward God as you are today. I persecuted the way to death, binding and delivering into prison both men and women. Listen to Romans chapter 10 and verse 18, or 10 verses 1 through 3. Next slide. Brethren, My heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted to the righteousness of God. Let's go to the Old Testament. Let's see a couple of characters who were heroes in the Shemite schools. One was in Numbers chapter 25. Numbers chapter 25. It is the story of let me get it right here, Aaron's grandson, Phinehas. It's in the aftermath of when Balak hired Balaam to curse Israel, and Balaam blessed them. And Balaam basically told Balak, he said, look, I can't curse God's people. But he said, I'll tell you how you can. If you'll send your pretty women down there to their lustful men, then you'll get God to curse them. Well, after the fact, the ruling was this: kill all of the men who had taken, I lost the name, who had been joined to Baal and had taken Midianite wives. That was the word I was looking for. So look at verse 7. Verse 7. Numbers 25, verse 7. Now when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw it, he rose from among the congregation. He took a javelin in his hand, and he went after the man of Israel into the tent and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her body. So the plague was stopped among the children of Israel. And those who died in the plague were 24,000. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the children of Israel, because he was zealous with my zeal among them. And so I did not consume the children of Israel in my zeal. It goes on to say, therefore say, behold, I give to him my covenant of peace, and it shall be to him and his descendants after him a covenant of an everlasting priesthood, because he was zealous for his God. This is how Paul and his cohorts believed you ought to serve God, with a javelin if need be. Another verse of Scripture that's quite interesting is in Psalm 106 that recants this event of Phinehas. Psalm 106, in midst of rehearsing the history of Israel, it mentions this moment. In verse 30, Psalm 106, verse 30, then Phinehas stood up and intervened, and the plague was stopped, and that was accounted to him for righteousness. Wait, Abraham believed God and it was accounted unto him for righteousness. Phinehas stabbed a man and the woman he was with a javelin, and it was accounted unto him for righteousness. I'm not sure that's the way to interpret that, but this was a story that this tradition of the Jews held in great regard. A zeal for God with God's zeal. There's another one. 2 Kings chapter 10. Wrong way. 2 Kings chapter 10. The story of King Jehu, who was, for lack of a better way to say it, was mopping up the remains of King Ahab. God had told King Ahab that all of your descendants would be killed. Well, in 2 Kings chapter 10 and verse 16, King Jehu is going to go and finish everything off. I won't read all of this, but look at verse 16. Then he said, "Come with me and see my zeal for God, for they had him ride in his chariot." We go all the way down through here, and it basically says that he killed all who remained from Ahab's house, and it fulfilled the word of the Lord as spoken to King Ahab by the prophet Elijah. So again, and I'm running short on time, so I have to move forward. But a zeal for God. This was what Paul lived by. Paul's persecution of Christians was motivated by his zealous obedience to what he thought God wanted him to do. Now, as Paul said in Romans, they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. Now, that's a very dangerous thing, by the way. To have zeal, but no knowledge. But I want you to try, if you can, before we get to Paul the preacher, to get under the skin of Paul the persecutor. And Paul was never short on zeal. Thankfully, on the other side of this, he had a zeal according to knowledge, and not a zeal that wasn't according to knowledge. Next slide. Ooh. I only have 10 slides to go in 15 minutes, so I'm going to summarize some stuff, okay? In slide 20, 21, 22, 23, all the way down to 24. I'll just kind of summarize all that. So chapter 6 of the book of Acts, here I'm going to set it up for you. I think that we still have a large group of people from all over who were in Jerusalem around the season of Passover, Feast of Weeks, Pentecost. There are a lot of people still there. It talks about all of these synagogue people. You have the synagogue of the freedmen. You have the synagogue of the Cyrenians, the Alexandrians. Both of those are in Africa. You have from Cilicia and Asia. Wait a minute, Cilicia. That rings a bell. Tarsus was in Cilicia. Very likely, the Apostle Paul had at least listened, or if not, participated in the debate that Stephen was carrying on in and among these synagogal people. It was a large debate, large discussion over what is this about Christ, and who is this Christ, and what has happened these past few days, and the crucifixion, and supposedly he rose again. And that's what got Stephen killed, by the way. That's what got him killed, was his debating with these Jews and then preaching. By the way, deacons, the longest sermon recorded in the Bible was preached by a deacon, just on record. And it got him killed. Paul sat there and listened to all that. Paul saw the manner in which Stephen died, chapter 7. Lord, lay not this to their charge. Which is almost like saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. His face, Stephen's face, glowed like an angel. All of that's going on in chapter 6 and chapter 7. You don't change a man in a day. So Paul was still Saul in chapter 7, verse 58 when he met him, and he was still Saul in chapter 8 when he made havoc of the churches, and he was still Saul in chapter 9 when he was breathing out threats against the church. How did this affect Paul? What was going on in Paul's heart and mind when he was walking up the Damascus road? Maybe, go ahead and go to the next slide. Here's an insight into what was going on in his heart. In verse 17 of Acts 22, Paul says, this is Paul. Now it happened when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple that I was in a trance. That's not some hocus pocus thing. Just basically he was meditating. He was very focused. He was praying in the temple, and he was very focused in his thoughts and his heart and his mind. Surely you've been to that place before. And then a vision did open to him. And he saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, for they will not receive your testimony concerning me. Now this happened after his conversion, of course, the first visit back to Jerusalem. And so I said, this is what Paul's thinking. Lord, they know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believed on you. And when the blood of your martyr witness Stephen was shed, I was standing by, consenting to his death, and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Then the Lord said to me, depart, for I will send you far from here to the Gentiles. Oh, I went the wrong way. Well, I don't know. I did these wrong. Did y'all notice that? Did y'all notice that I did these wrong? Sorry. I'm struggling with them as well. Go to the next slide and then the next one, because I'm going to run out of time. One more. No, that's it. That's it. Sorry, you were right. Ananias, when he meets Paul, says, Lord, I have heard from many about this man. His reputation preceded him. How much harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priest to bind all who call on your name. This is what else Paul said about himself. Next slide. I was formerly a blasphemer, to speak evil of God. That's what blasphemer means. It actually is a Greek word. A persecutor. An insolent, that's violent. A violent man. Now, I don't think Paul ever spoke evil of God, as in he called God a bad name or spoke irreverently of God. But I tell you who he did speak evil of and irreverently of: Jesus Christ. Because when he met Jesus on the road, what's the first thing that Jesus said to him?
Lord, why do you persecute?
Why are you persecuting me? This is Saul. If you were a Christian, and I hope you are, you would not want to come into the same room with Saul. He would kill you if he could. I want you to see what a violent, evil, I'll use that word, almost maddening kind of man that he was. I thought about this. I didn't put it in my slides because I didn't want to go on record, and I know I'm live, so I am on record. I will tell you, in reading and studying and looking at all this, y'all are going to get me, so y'all scold me later when I say this. I couldn't help but think of jihadists. People who think that they are serving God's interest with violence. This was the Apostle Paul. And he thought that the more Christians he could get rid of, the more righteous, like Phineas, he would be. Acts chapter 9. Next slide. As he journeyed, Paul, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Saul was a persecutor of Jesus and his followers who became the great preacher of Jesus Christ that converted many followers. Galatians 4:17. Next slide, please. 2 slides. Paul said in Galatians, they zealously court you. There's that word again. He's talking about Judaizers. People who were just like him. Why did Paul understand in Romans and in Galatians these Judaizers so well? It's almost like he could crawl into their skin. Because he was one. He was one. He was the very kind of person that he was writing against in Romans and he was writing against in Galatians. They zealously court you, but for no good. Yes, they want to exclude you, as in they want to bring you over and you can't have anything to do with anybody else but us. That you may be zealous for them. It is good to be zealous in a good thing always. I think Paul learned that lesson the hard way. I honestly think, in knowing the life of Paul as I've tried to learn him, I don't think Paul ever really, in this life, got beyond the memories of the past and what he had done. That's why he calls himself the chief of sinners. I mean, you look at that in 1 Timothy, and it's in the context of, I was a persecutor. I mean, I know of people that have fought wars, and I can remember, I don't mind to share this one. Everybody remembers Ralph Black. He was a survivor of D-Day in World War II. And I was at his house one time and he had a World War D-Day book, and I just opened it up, trying to make conversation with Ralph Black, where you just have to work at it, you know. And I got to talking to him about that, and I said, now you stormed the beaches of, you did all that, right? Saving Private Ryan and all that. He didn't know what I was talking about. He was a mechanic over there. And he actually opened up and he talked to me about that. I told his son Eddie later when we were at his funeral, and he said, really? He said, he's never told me about that. But anyway, Ralph had some really painful memories of watching his friends die and seeing dead bodies laid on the beach every day. I think Paul was haunted by what he did as a persecutor. Even though he had forgiveness, but he struggled, I think, all of his life, knowing what he had done. Paul was not God. Now, he might have been God's best friend, and he was a sinner just like you and me. He struggled. He had a past. He thought he was serving God in zeal, but he wasn't doing anything but murdering people. And when that came to light, it really hurt him. This was his early life. We hadn't scratched the surface yet. We're going to get into when he was converted, what happened to him when he was in Damascus. What was that 3-year thing, 3 years in Arabia? I don't know. We'll look at that as well. The Apostle Paul was a terrible persecutor, but by the grace of God, he said, only by the grace of God, I am what I am. And he was completely forgiven. That should tell us that no matter who you are or what you've done, God can not only forgive you, and he will, and save you, and he will, but he can do great things with you if you will let him. If he could do great things with Paul, he can do great things with us as well. Thanks for being with us tonight. And I did well on time. All right, let me mention just a few announcements, and we'll say goodbye to our online audience, and we'll go into prayer requests. Brother Roger Stewart, who is the Secretary-Treasurer of ABA Missions, will be with us on Sunday, and he will be telling us about the mission work of the American Baptist Association, as well as preaching for us. We will have a business meeting to follow the morning service. Brother Roger will have a booth out, and I want you to meet him and talk to him and his wife, Gina, and great people. Love them in the Lord, and glad they're going to be here with us. There is also a table set up out there in the foyer for JD and Shelby. It's called an old-fashioned pounding. And I brought my bat. I thought, really? Bad joke, right? Give them some food, some household items. Let's send them on their married life with a lot of love. Let's show them some love. That's out there in the foyer. I think it's a couple of weeks that they're going to be doing that. So bring your stuff this Sunday and let's show them some church love. Any other announcements? Sunday school, yes. Sunday school will be here on campus this Sunday. Adults will meet in the auditorium. Brother Kevin Chadwick is going to be teaching that lesson for us. And so looking forward to that. We're in the Gospel of Matthew, so come and be here on campus. It is also going to be broadcast live on our online feed as well, so you can tune in. Now, there will not be a recorded Sunday school class for the adults sent out. That was going on for a while, so you're going to have to get up on Sunday and come to church or watch us live. So now it will be a recording after the fact, but the live service, 9:45, you won't be getting your Sunday school as a video on Saturday. All right, any other announcements? If not, then thank you for our online audience being here with us tonight. God bless you. Have a good rest of the week. Let's move to prayer requests now.